Okay, we are live at the moment. Those who are tuning in now, just bear with me while I do the usual setup. Brian can do jazz hands or something to keep you entertained, since you don't usually have your keys, as disappointing as that is. Okay, here we go.
I do have my keys, actually. I just have to dig them out of my pocket.
So jangle, jangle, jangle. Okay, there we go.
There we go. Ooh, shiny.
Shiny, shiny.
Shiny.
Okay, post it here. And one more place, and then we're good to go.
Hmm.
That's what's weird about it. Okay, we're all set. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Paranormal Encyclopedia. What's going to be our new official night? We were going to do it on Thursdays, but it's as it turns out, I have too many things going on Thursdays. It just doesn't work. So we're going to do it on Wednesdays. And hey, Lisa for Truth, welcome to the chat. Lisa says good news for democracy. I'm assuming that it's from what I was looking at just before we started. It looks like at the moment it's not a huge margin, but the despite what the Republicans were all swearing was going to happen, we have not seen a giant red tide of everybody suddenly voting Republican.
Good.
Yeah. As much as I don't like to be political, I'm a big fan of that. I'm not happy. I consider myself a conservative person insofar as I believe that the less influence government has on people's lives, the better. But the Republican Party doesn't embrace that idea at all. So I am not a Republican.
Big difference.
Yeah. And what a Republican should be. Small government. The government doesn't get to tell you how to live your life. The last
Probably closer to libertarian, but even they're kind of crazy now.
I was gonna say they tend to be a little nutty, and I don't go quite so far as they do on some things.
Yeah.
And
Really, you're probably just kind of a conservative Democrat
yeah, that would be how I describe it. A
with
proper conservative
a few
Democrat.
particular issues, but yeah,
And
mostly you agree with them.
I'm getting more and more. Yeah, unlike the stereotype, I'm getting more liberal as I get older.
Yeah, me too. Actually, that's happened to me. The more I learn about things, the more
Yeah,
I embrace kind of a progressive point of view.
the more people you meet, the harder it is to be as callous as conservatives tend to be, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's really what it comes down to.
But we're getting political, and I don't really want to do that. So let's do introductions. We got a little more news to share, then we'll get into tonight's topic. So
Yes.
as always, I am your host, Kevin Meares, demonologist, paranormal encyclopedia, ghost hunter. I am joined by my co-host, the beautiful and alluring
As sometimes author Brian McKinley, godfather of vampire thrillers.
at least it's absolutely fine going there. I mean, it's the night after an election. It was inevitably going to come up.
It's kind of on everybody's mind
Yeah.
in some way.
So I do want to share some good news that is confirmed, pretty much confirmed at this point, barring some crazy thing happening with the psychos in Russia. But as it stands, my trip to Romania that got canceled this year because of Putin is on for this coming June.
Cool.
I've gotten an updated itinerary. I've heard from the people running the trip. Everything is sounding good. I'm incredibly excited. Um, I will give our friend and sometimes guest Thinker Stoker a shout out because he just published the 125th anniversary of Dracula, because it has now been 125 years since the date of publication,
Mm.
and it is a huge annotated copy of the book. I'm currently working my way through it now. It includes the a bunch of cut material, like what became the short story Dracula's Guest is in there.
Mm.
Um, it's a lot of fun. Lisa, I'm still not sure about that. It's under renovation. I was under the impression it was the renovations were supposed to be done next year, but now it's looking like maybe they won't be. We're at least going to be near Ponari Castle, which is Vlad's actual castle, and we'll be going to Snagov, which is the monastery that he may or may not have been buried at, and actually the island the monastery sits on may or may not, records are a little scanty, be where he was killed by Janissary soldiers in 1476.
Oh.
Um, Granted, we don't even know if that's how he died. There's conflicting versions of what happened. Um, he may have been. There's stories he was killed by the Turks. There's stories he was killed by his own men, either in an act of betrayal or because he had been caught on the other side of enemy lines, disguised and had to disguise himself to get back, and he got mistaken for a Turkish soldier. Um, it's a lot of unknowns. If I get the chance while I'm over there, since I am planning to do EVP on the island of Snagov, I'll try and ask him.
I knew that was coming. I knew you were going to try to get Dracula's ghost.
Can you blame? Wouldn't you?
Well, sure, but you won't be able to understand what he's saying.
Which is why I'm making an effort to learn some Romanian between now and then. Well, that and I'd actually like to know a little bit. Maybe I mean I don't expect like I'll be fluent, but it'd be nice if I could be able to order lunch, for example, or at least say give a basic greeting. I think it's always nice if you're going to go on vacation to try to learn a little bit of the language.
Oh, sure. I'm just thinking like because he'd
Mm-mm.
still be speaking like 14th century Romanian
Yeah,
or something. So it'd be like going back to the 14th century and trying to speak to an English speaker.
like, uh, I'll come back to that in a second. I want to comment on Lisa's suggestion. I actually looked into Babbel. At least what I could find, it doesn't seem like it actually includes Romanian. I did try Duolingo, which my fiance swears by, does have is a free app that has Romanian, but I'm not quite connecting with the app. I'm also really abysmal with languages, and it doesn't help that from the research I've done, Romanian is in fact a romance language. Of all the existing romance languages, it actually has the most languages from words and phrasing and things that are original to the Latin. Although there's also a healthy dose of Slavic in there, so it's supposed to be the hardest of all the Romance languages to learn.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And trying to learn a little bit of it, it's like, yeah, I remember smatterings of Spanish and French from high school. It doesn't sound a lot like them.
No.
Um, but I am working on it. I would point out that I don't know about Romanian because it's a different language, but 14th century, or actually 15th century would be Vlad's time period,
Okay.
because 1431 to 1476. 15th century English is early modern English.
It is, but it's listening to it conversationally. You'd probably have a really hard time following it unless you could pick out like particular words and get the gist of what someone was saying to you. The vernacular is going to be very different.
I, I can't say for spoken. I don't have that. I mean, like most people, I don't have that much exposure to spoken early modern English.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
But
you just look at like Shakespeare. If everybody's
Shakespeare, the Bible,
yeah, if everybody's
King
talking
James
like
particularly.
Shakespeare, you're gonna have a hard time kind of following along.
Granted, the kind of argument to that is nobody talk like they talk in Shakespearean plays.
Oh no, no,
His
not
dialogue is very lyrical and beautiful, but it's not realistic. Even in terms of vernacular, it's weird. It's pretty weird for the time period.
Oh yeah, no, he did make up a lot of words and kind of
And
coin a lot of terms that we still
yeah,
have.
and use obscure terms and
Yeah.
but I'm also just thinking it's like I just got started back into my witch research, so I'm burying myself in early modern English right now.
True.
And oh god, it's not hard, it's just a chore. As I still like to put it, and I've put it since I went to college the first time or the second time. It's reading early modern English or middle English, which is also enough like modern English that modern English speakers can generally read it, is like translating English into English because it's so close to modern spoken English, but it's not quite there.
Yeah.
So you basically have to translate it, which gives at least gives me a headache. I can't speak for anybody else. Although that does tie into my other good news, which is that starting in spring, I'm going back to college.
Oh yeah.
I'm going back. I'm starting out looking at a associate's degree, although I'm looking to go further at a local community college in history.
Cool.
So yeah, next Monday I put in the sign up for all my classes basically, which is the earliest I could do it. Then I'll have to go get my textbooks and all that. I'm doing full time, all online, and get her done. I've been meaning to do it for years. I'm looking forward to finally actually doing it. My
Cool.
fiance, of course, thinks I'm nuts because I'm taking 5 classes and gonna be working full time, and she's not wrong. And then there's some overlap, like world history classes and World War II history and things like that, and also the reality of the classes are online. I can do them at work. I can do things at my a little bit more at my own pace.
Yeah, it
I
does
don't have
help
to
that you
wake
have a
up.
job where you can get a lot of reading and stuff done.
Yeah, but no, I'm looking forward to it. If I'll do a couple weeks. If it seems overwhelming, I'll look at dropping a couple classes before the drop. The period ends, and I can still get refunds and things like that. Um, do you have anything you want to update everybody on? Anything new going on with your writing?
Uh, I don't know if I mentioned it before. There's a book out now called The Horror Addict's Guide to Life, Volume Two, and I have a couple of essays in there that are essentially article versions
Hmm.
of parts of my old vampire lecture. I wrote them out and turned them into articles with distinct, beginnings, middles, and ends, and submitted them to this website, the Horror Addict's Guide to Life, and they were accepted for publication. So
You had mentioned that before, but I was actually just about to bring it up because it's worth repeating.
yeah, so if anybody's interested in just a some overview on funky vampire myths from around the world, there's also a lot of other great articles in those books from other people.
I haven't gotten to picking it up yet. I am planning on it. Um, I got lucky with the 125th anniversary of Dracula because it's free on Amazon Kindle Unlimited. That's a name for it.
Cool.
But I am looking forward to picking those up. I will also give you a shout out, both because you're my co-host and because I've been to your vampire lectures before. Um, Brian knows his stuff. He knows vampire folklore better than I do, or just about anyone else I've met does. So I would definitely recommend checking out those books and those articles that he wrote. Um, we should do it. We've talked about like Eastern European vampire folklore. We should really get into something about some of the weirder stuff one of these days.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I'd love to talk about some of the funnier uh, vampire myths from around the world. There are some strange ones.
Why don't we do that next week?
Okay, that could be a potential topic. I'll brush up on some of those.
McKinley's Field Guide to Vampires.
Yeah,
We can do a series of episodes like this to vampires, we're doing ghosts tonight. We can do vampires. We can do werewolves, or were creatures because there's
Where
so many
creatures,
more
yeah,
things out there than
shapeshifters.
werewolves.
Yeah, in
Dragons are all over the bloody place.
general. Fae,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
the
Which is
different
really
kind.
fascinating as well. Just like how similar you have legends in England, which is mostly where we get our idea of fae, is the British Isles,
Yep.
England, Ireland, Scotland. But you have very similar stories in the New World among the native indigenous tribes here. You have some similarities to Svartals and Alls in Norwegian and Scandinavian folklore, or even to some extent to Kitsune and yokai in Japan.
Mhm.
Because Japanese ghosts are really weird, although that's actually something to talk on a little bit about tonight. And then we can get more into the Fae because they kind of, which is another thing we've talked about in the past, and it's worth saying, is these neat little divisions people have between this is a ghost, this is a demon, this is a werewolf, a vampire, whatever, is a very modern way of looking at it.
Oh yeah, I learned that when looking into vampires. There are a lot of things that are now considered fae creatures that have distinctly vampiric elements in their origins and in their stories. So I group them in as types of vampires, but other people would call them fairies.
Well, that's actually Fae in general are a really good example in terms of talking about types of ghosts because people tend to see Fae now as their own thing. Leprechauns and elves
Right.
and all these other categories. In folklore from the Middle Ages, Fae were spirits in some versions of it. Fae were spirits of the dead.
Oh.
Usually, very particularly, they're spirits of the unbaptized dead, or particularly people who died before Christianity came to the British Isles. So you have this idea they can't go to heaven because they've never heard the word of Christ, but they can't really be damned to hell either, because how do you condemn somebody for not knowing what they don't know?
Right.
So they get left in this kind of limbo state here, and that's where you get fairies.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that would make sense because of the whole idea of the mounds,
Yes,
which were in many
burial
cases
mounds.
grave mounds. Yeah, that the Fae were supposed to come in and out of, and that being the gateway to the either the underworld or to Arcadia or whatever.
Arcadia, Avalon.
Yep.
It's got a bunch of different Elf Elfheim. I want to say, but no, this other world. Um, the thing is, there's all if you go into folklore, there's a whole bunch series of different categories of ghosts. People talk about wraiths, which are supposed to be the evil dead. They talk about not related to the movie, as great a movie as the Evil Dead series are. Um, the Green Man, drowning victims that come back. Um, La Llorona and the Lady in White here in the United States.
Mm.
Um, from a paranormal investigator standpoint, we don't really break them down that much. Partly because there are so many different categories like that in so many different cultures. It gets really convoluted, particularly because again, like the fair, in one cut, a perfect example of the way that these categories get overlap. Strigoi, depending on if you're talking about Italian and different other countries in Eastern Europe, that might be a witch, it might be a vampire, it might be a demon, it might be some combination of the above.
Yeah.
Um, and go, if you go, Japan's very interesting because they have, I want to say yokai and yurei. Although I probably have the second one wrong. But yokai are Japanese ghosts, which are very specific.
Oh, it looks like
And the
we've
other,
lost your visual.
oh, yeah, it'll come back. There's nothing
Okay.
I can do. It's this just gets weird.
All right.
But I do not remember. There's a yeah, Yorei. So basically, Yorei in Japanese folklore are ghosts in the way the rest of us see them, as opposed to yokai, which are the very specific ghosts, kind of unique to Japan.
Huh.
Um, Although because if you notice, watch The Grudge, watch The Ring, play the Fatal Frame games. You do watch almost any Japanese horror movie involving ghosts. You ever notice they all look the same? They wear a white kimono, which is because in Japanese culture, I want to say, I know in Chinese culture, I believe Japanese as well, white's associated with death,
Yeah, I think they borrowed that from the
as opposed,
Chinese.
yeah. Whereas in European culture, black is associated with death.
Yeah.
But there is a Buddhist artist from centuries ago, and the story, as I understand it, goes that one night a ghost came into his room, and the next day he painted the ghost. And the thing is, this Japanese artist was very famous for he only painted things that he, because of his beliefs as a Buddhist, he only painted what he saw exactly as he saw it. So Japanese ghosts all look like what he saw. This woman in a white kimono with long black hair covering her face. It's the one you see in every Japanese ghost movie.
Right.
And that's why they all look the same. They have a different type name. They call our ghosts Yurei because our ghosts are very strange to them. That's not what ghosts look like. They know what ghosts looks like. This guy drew painted one he saw, and he only paints what he saw. So that's obviously what a ghost looks like.
Right.
Um, the other thing that's fascinating with Japanese spirits is Western spirits are ethereal and insubstantial. They walk through walls. They don't have a body. Japanese spirits have a body.
Huh.
Um, you know, they're actual. I believe they can still walk through walls to some extent, but they are they're more substantial than Western spirits, which
Hmm.
isn't exclusive. I mean, there are some Western stories that's again overlapping with vampires. Um, Vampires are generally seen as physical, and in stories usually are described as physical, but it's not quite that simple either because there's a lot of stories. There's the one Hungarian, I want to say vampire, that spends all its time in its grave chewing on its funeral shroud.
Oh yes, yes. The I just saw a thing about this, and yeah, they have a particular name. The was it shroud chewers? I think it might be that that simple.
I'm very disappointed in you. I was expecting you to like belt out the name in Hungarian for them or
I
something like
know, I know. I did not. I'm aware of them, but I do not remember their actual like name. I'm bad. I'm just as bad as you
that.
with
Yeah,
languages, so
fair
I
enough.
I can't pronounce a whole lot of stuff.
But there are other stories where the vampire is supposed to still be laying in its coffin, but at the same time the body's in the coffin, it's going out and attacking people.
Yeah, it can like send its spirit.
Yeah. But again, it's supposed to usually not always, but still feeding on blood, and it still has some characteristics of being physical, but also being a spirit. Um, so instead of continuing to mire too much in folkloric ideas of ghosts, let me talk about the way ghost hunters usually characterize hauntings.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm interested in because like
Yeah.
I when I think about ghosts, I kind of think of generally two types
What two do you think of?
that you hear about the most often. Well, you hear about the most typical idea of ghosts, which is a deceased person that still seems to have their memories. They still
Hmm.
seem to have some kind of will or consciousness, and they do things deliberately. You know, they move objects. They have apparently like reasons for doing things, and they're trying to accomplish something. Then you have these other ones that seem more like just kind of historical echoes where they
Hmm.
just seem to show up visibly, but they just repeat a pattern over and over again to everyone who sees them. Like some of the famous hauntings where people say that they've seen this particular ghost and that ghost becomes very famous. It's always that ghost doing the exact same thing. So it's like I'm in my mind, there's like, okay, there's two distinct types. One might be a ghost and one might be something else, like a resonance or a residue or something. But I figured I would
You're
get
right. You, by the
get
way,
get your opinion on
there's a
that.
couple more categories, but those are the two big ones. The intelligent haunting, which is the one everybody thinks about. And then there's what's called the residual haunting, which is the other thing that you're describing.
Oh, cool.
Um, so the big categories of ghosts that you usually see, there are the classic haunting, the intelligent haunting, residual hauntings, um, what's called the crisis apparition, which is, at least I find it very fascinating.
Hmm.
I'll come back. We'll come back and discuss each of these in turn. Um, poltergeists,
Right.
and then there's kind of not. I don't see it written up in paranormal literature as much, but I would also add a category of visitors, and I'll come back to what I mean by each.
Oh,
So, so I'll start with the intelligent haunting is more or less what people think of it. It's a person's mind has spirit, soul, whatever you want to call it, is still here. They haunt a house, they haunt an object, they can haunt a person. This is a very common mistake that people make is people tend to think they're always bound to locations. There's a really good TV series I would recommend that you can see on on Paramount called Ghosts.
yeah. Heard of it.
And, or not Paramount, excuse me. It's on both. It is on Paramount. It's on Paramount and it's on Peacock.
Right.
Paramount has the original British version. Peacock has the American version.
Oh, okay.
They are very different series. I would actually recommend them both. But a plot point in both of them is that spirits are stuck in the location that they died, which is a common part of folklore, of course.
Yeah.
It's not actually true. Um, spirits tend to stick to somewhere very important to them in life, which may be where they died. It might also be the house. You know, if they bought a house and lived it for 40 years with the love of their life, and then died in the hospital down the street, they're probably going to go live in the house they lived in for 40 years with the love of their life that they had built. You know, they helped build with their own hands and things like that. It's something that's personally important to the person that tends to be what they haunt.
Sure.
It can also it can also be objects. Um, and sometimes they haunt people too. Although with human spirits that's less common. Um, they're stuck. There's some reason they can't move on. The horror movies basically get that right. Um, it may be that they don't accept the fact that they're dead yet. It may be that they're afraid of what's going to happen next. They think they're going to burn in hell, for example.
Hmm.
Um, I don't agree with that. That's a concern for this type of ghost, by the way. Because the complaint I get from other Christians is that the Bible says that we are to die but once and then we face judgment. So they want to know, how do these spirits short circuit Judgment Day? I and there are other theological perspectives on this, so I am not the be all and end all authority. But in my opinion, is this: I believe that ghosts have been judged. I believe that God has accepted that they are worthy of heaven, but that person isn't ready to go yet. So God, in His mercy, allows them to remain.
Hmm.
Damned souls can come back, and we'll revisit that further down the list of types. But normal hauntings are not the work of souls in hell, from hell. They're the work of souls that aren't ready to go to heaven. Um, and they can be helped to cross over by sometimes by helping them realize what, yeah, you're dead, you can't come back. Sometimes, one of the oldest ways that people come back as ghosts, going back to ancient Greece, is somebody doesn't bury the body properly. Um, and particularly not buried with proper ceremonies and things like that. You should be very familiar with this, because this is also one of the ways you get vampires, I believe.
In some cases, yeah, especially in China,
Yes,
moonlight shining on a body was considered especially bad and would result in a jiangshi.
but yeah, the oldest known ghost story, which is an example of an intelligent haunting, or the oldest written one, I should say, in the classic modern sense, because there are older stories, certainly,
Mm.
is from Pliny the Younger, which is a philosopher who moves into a house in the city of Athens. And for years, they haven't been able to rent this house because the house has a ghost. Everybody moves in, runs out screaming. It's very much your classic ghost story. The philosopher needs somewhere to stay. He's working on a bunch of complicated philosophical problems. He's like, I don't care. Maybe the ghost would be good company for me. They're like, okay, here you go. So he set up his first night, and he's like, I'm going to work on a really hard philosophical problem to keep my mind off this whole thing. And he's writing well into the night, and hears moaning and chains being shaken coming down the hallway. And he ignores it, keeps working, comes into the room, ignores it, keeps working. Moaning gets louder, chains shaking gets louder. Finally, he looks up, and there's an old man. He's a ghost, he's transparent, he's covered in chains, beckoning the philosopher to come with him. Finally, the philosopher puts down his pen, his quill, gets up and follows the ghost. The ghost takes him out into the courtyard and points to a specific spot under the tree and disappears. The philosopher marks the place on the ground, goes back inside and goes back to bed. The next day, he has workers come. They dig the spot that he marked. They find a skeleton covered in chains. They take the body away. They bury it with a proper funeral. The house is never haunted again.
Right.
This story is very common all over the world. Jiangxi of China, as you said, have similar stories about bury the body, give them the rituals. Um, but again, it's intelligence. It has a purpose. It couldn't speak, but it communicated. Residuals is the other thing that you're talking about, where it's less an active intelligence and more like a tape recording of a series of events. Footsteps up and down the hall. A spirit of a spirit seen doing the same thing over and over again. It's repetition. It doesn't deviate. You can't interact with it. It just is there. Um, there's theories in parapsychology about why this is. Popular ones known as the stone tape theory, which suggests that certain types of stone, particularly granite, particularly anything for that matter, with a high quartz content, can record emotionally charged events.
Hmm.
And then, if under certain circumstances, particularly thunderstorms, can replay them. So you'll find residual hauntings. You usually find them at like the site of a murder, something, some sort of serious fight, battle, military battles, emotionally charged events. You don't usually hear about the old lady who died in her sleep has a residual haunting. Sometimes, but not often.
Mm.
Um, so those are the two probably best known. Poltergeists are also an interesting category, mostly because poltergeist isn't a type of ghost. It isn't a type of spirit. It's a umbrella term for a type of phenomenon.
Right.
It's marked by a couple of things. Objects moving of their own, objects moving without any visible means propelling them. Sound, smells, elemental phenomenon like fire starting up out of thin air, rain inside of buildings,
Mm.
stones falling from the sky. Um, Particularly, you don't see a humanoid form in most poltergeist cases. If any type of spirit manifests, it's usually mist, or some other indistinct, vague form.
Right.
Now, the question that often comes up is, what are poltergeists? There's a whole series of theories. One theory is what's called spontaneous recurrent psychokinesis. It's believed that everyone has some degree or another of psychic ability. During extremely emotionally charged events, puberty, for example, it gets kicked out. So it's thought that in some cases, some people who have just a little bit of ability to move things with their mind, when they go through puberty or through some other highly emotionally charged event, cause this kind of phenomenon. Um, Poltergeist activity, regardless of the cause, is usually very short in duration, a couple of weeks, a couple of years at the most, and it just stops and nothing ever happens again.
Mm.
Um, there are other explanations for it. Some people think that it's ghosts. Some people think that it's elementals tying into the whole fire and water and earth and things like that. Some people think it's demons.
Huh.
Personally, I think all of the above is true, and you can add fairies in for good measure. Um, Again, it's a category of activity. It's not a category of spirit. It comes from German meaning polter, meaning noisy, Geist meaning spirit or ghost. Um, I think marrying yourself to a single definition of what a poltergeist is too limiting. I think there's too many different things it might be.
Right.
One of the ones that people don't talk about as much, but is really interesting in terms of the remaining categories, though, is a crisis apparition,
Mm.
which in some ways is the most common type of spirit. But nobody, people don't talk about it as much because nobody has ever been or ever will be haunted by a crisis apparition. You're, but you've heard stories. You've probably heard, most of you have heard stories like this before. Um, a mother hears her son scream out at the same time that he gets shot and maybe even dies in war halfway across the world. Um, a woman, a doctor late at night gets a knock on her door. A woman desperate that him come and save their sick daughter or son goes, rushes, saves the kid. It's like, so where's the mother? The mother's been dead 10 years. Um, there's spirits that have just, or if you really, really want to get weird with it, someone go back to that first example I gave. Mother hears her son scream out. Same time in happens. She hears of this in the United States. Same time, the son gets into a car accident in England and survives. There are even a few stories of people seeing the person appear briefly
Hmm.
and then vanish, but the person survived. This is what we call crisis apparitions. They appear or they are heard in a moment of emergency or death, or at the moment of death,
Hmm.
and they're gone. They're never seen again.
Kind of like a fetch, like
Sort of.
the legend of a fetch.
A little, it's very similar but different. If memory serves, Fetch is a body double of yourself that you see that's usually an omen of death.
Yeah, there's that, or there's the other one where you see an apparition of someone who you know who is about to die. I think
And
that
yeah.
sometimes happens too.
So yes, it's a very similar concept, and really a fetch would probably fall into this category.
Mm.
Um, although the fetch also relates to a whole other classification of spirit, which are known as and actually this is another one to add to the list, which is doppelgangers or alter egos,
Yeah.
which is when you see the ghost of a living person, um, who's still alive. They may even be there when you see them. Um, this is a really bizarre phenomenon. Um, that we don't have a really, even in the occult community, I've never heard a really good explanation of. Um, Astral projection sometimes gets brought up. There's an idea called biolocation, which basically is somebody being able to be in two places at once.
Mm.
It's usually associated with saints. Padre Pio, for example, is known to have supposedly have biolocated and been witnessed by thousands of people in two different locations simultaneous. And I don't mean like he was seen in the monastery and he was seen 3 blocks away at the same time. I mean, he was seen in Italy and in France at the same time by thousands of people. Well, there's no, oh, well, he just, stepped out real quick and it was close enough to other people, makes up the time. Um, there's a famous story of him coming out of his monastic cell and brushing snow off of his robes. And the fellow monks look at him and go, "Where'd that come from? You've been inside all day and it's quite warm outside." And him claiming he had just been on a mountaintop delivering last rites to to dying mountain hikers. Um, which actually leads into a whole other category I'll touch on just because it's fascinating. I honestly don't claim to know what's up with doppelgangers and fetches. Most, I will say, as a point of interest, most cultures that have stories of this, and there's a lot that do. Seeing your duplicate or someone else's duplicate is usually bad. It's a sign they're about to die. There's an exception to this. Judaism has stories of seeing your double, and it's actually considered good luck.
Mm.
Um, the only explanation I've heard offered, other than the bilocation saints, gods intervening, let's not trip down that level of theology today. Um, is that basically it's like part of that person, usually the dark side of that person's personality, splitting off and taking a spiritual form briefly. Um, I don't, which is where the whole alter ego like comes from. It's your own evil, like it's your alter ego's. The spirit of your alter ego is basically your own evil side.
Right.
I'm not saying I buy into that. It's just this is a whole weird set of things that nobody has a good explanation for.
Yeah.
So, second to last category, because I just thought of one more, is what I'm calling the returned, which
Okay.
has a lot in common with crisis spirits. Um,
Right.
but
I
there's
think I know what
spirits,
you're talking about. Yeah.
yeah. Most people who've listened have heard me talk about this idea before. There are broadly two types of spirit that fall into this category, but there's the very positive ones, which is little kid. You'll have little kids that will describe in great detail family members who died before they were born,
Yeah.
coming to visit them. Um, Kubler-Ross, I can't think of her first name, but the woman who famously wrote the book on death and dying. There's a whole other chapter to her book that didn't get published. Because the thing is, like, Kubler Ross spent a lot of time with people dying. And back when um nobody talked about it, they didn't have extended. Nowadays Elizabeth Kubler Ross, that's her name. But nowadays, if your family member is dying, they pretty much start ignoring things like visiting hours because they're dying. There's nothing that can be done about it. You need to give family time to say goodbye and things like that.
Right.
But this was back in a time when if you were dying, the medical staff usually didn't tell you. You didn't get to see, you didn't get visitors, or you didn't get visitors very often. You just got shoved away in a corner of the hospital and nobody talked to you. So she started going out and talking to these people. And a lot of important work got done because of this. For example, many people have probably heard of the 5 stages of grief, the whole denial, bargaining,
Yeah.
and eventually acceptance. That's her work.
Oh,
And it came from this book on death and dying. But the other thing that she ran into is stories of like a little boy who was dying. And one day, um, somebody comes in during visiting hours, spends a lot of time with him, an older gentleman, leaves. The family comes later and they're like, "Do you know who this person was? He came and spent a bunch of time with your son." It's like, it doesn't make any sense. That's his grandfather who
right.
died before he was even born. Never met him, never saw a picture of him. Yet somehow the kid, the hospital staff have a detailed description of what this person looks like.
Hmm.
It's also very, very common, most often in dreams, but not always. Um, that people will have experiences. They'll hear at least the recently deceased talk to them, say maybe just say their name, may see them visit them in a dream, may see them appear in the physical world. Gives them a moment of comfort, a moment of relief, and disappears.
Yeah, I can
Me-
actually attest
Yeah,
to that. I had that happen with my
really.
yeah. Yep. It's my one sort of oddly paranormal experience that I can't explain other than, I mean, granted it was in a dream, so you can chalk it up to the fact that it was just a dream, but I did have a dream where my father visited me a few weeks after his death, and we sat and talked and kind of said our goodbyes. And I remember the weird thing about it was that I was acutely aware in the dream that he had died and that I was talking to him, and this was probably, like some sort of ghost or visiting
How did
spirit.
he look when he showed up in your dream? Did he look at like just before he died?
Not just, no, he kind of looked, I think, the way I had last seen him
Mm-hmm.
in when we had video chatted.
Mm-hmm.
He had sent me a an early like webcam that I hooked up to my
Okay,
computer, and we were able. He was on his laptop back at home, and I was on my computer in Illinois, and we were able to like web chat
that's really
briefly
cool.
for that. And yeah, I remember him kind of looking basically just like that. Because unfortunately, when he did actually pass, he had sort of a massive stroke caused by
Oh,
blood sugar, an
yeah.
extremely high blood sugar. And he didn't regain consciousness the entire time that I was there. He was just unconscious in the hospital. So I never actually got to, say goodbye or exchange like words with him.
But you did get to in the stream.
In this dream, yeah. And it was very vivid, and I just always kind
It
of
wasn't a dream. I
remembered it.
mean,
Yeah.
other skeptical people and even some religious people will argue with me, but the reality is this is a people. This is a very common experience that millions of people have had it all
Mhm.
over the world for all of recorded history. So sometimes the dead come back to say their last. Actually, very often I think the dead come back to say their last goodbyes. Um, It's often exactly like you're describing. This is very common. It's not unusual at all.
Yeah.
And there's I can't say I've ever had this experience. Um, but I'll tell you a funny enough story Father Joe told me. Some years back when he was still with us, he was in a car accident, and it was a pretty bad accident. He had a vision of his friend, my friend and my old mentor Lou Gentili, all in white, pointing at him and going, "You're not done yet. You've got to go back," leading him to snark a little bit about, "Yeah, everybody else gets to see Jesus, and I get to see Lou." In the
Kind of
near, yeah, with the whole near death experience thing,
the classic Hollywood.
because I know you guys are out there, and you're probably saying, Brian's dream was just that, just a dream, and some of these other experiences are just a dream. And there's
Yeah.
a long discussion that we can and probably at some point should have about the nature of near death experience and the reality that science doesn't understand it nearly as well as people think they do.
Hmm.
I mean, we have had instances where people were hooked up to machines to measure brainwave patterns as they died. They died, their brain stopped functioning in
Hmm.
any testable way. And while they were brain dead, they had a near death experience.
Yeah.
And the only explanation I've ever heard offered for this is, well, the brain must be still active. And what evidence do you have for that claim? It's like, we can't find brain activity. You're saying it because it's the only explanation that fits into your worldview. You can say there must have been brain activity, but okay, it's taking it from a skeptical perspective. Show me evidence of that brain activity, other than they had this experience. If you can't, you can say it's there and we can't detect it. But if we can't detect it, but more significantly than that, I think what's important here in the takeaway is the impact that these experiences have on people. It gave you a chance to say goodbye.
Yeah.
Um,
And I do
I'm not.
remember waking
Yeah,
up feeling like distinctly like a sense of kind of relief and calm, which was kind of unusual.
yeah, and
So
that's what people who have these experiences inevitably say over and over and over again. And if you don't want to believe that it's objectively real, that they actually spoke to a dead person, okay, acknowledge the fact that it's a positive experience for the person, that the person's better off having it than not, and let it be.
yeah, I mean, there's no harm to it,
Yeah. There's
whatever it
no harm and
is.
there's a great deal of good.
Yeah,
You found a sense of peace, it sounds like. If you look at, there are lots of stories of people having near death experiences and coming back and making something better out of, addicts that give up their addictions. There's stories of people having the other type, because there's another whole other type of near death experience that people don't talk about as much.
yeah,
Not everybody goes to heaven.
right. Yeah, I've heard some of those on talk shows.
Yeah. But there's a story of a guy who was a mob hitman, had an experience of hell. Yeah, I guess who cleaned up his freaking life afterwards. And I think the impact even arguably more so than the objective reality is what matters more. Is it did whether it was a product of a dying mind or it was a legitimate spiritual experience, that it changed that person's life in a positive way is what really matters. Which is kind of my pragmatic side of, does it matter if it worked, or does it matter how it worked if it worked? And
Hmm.
to some extent it does, particularly with a lot of other things, because snake oil and the placebo effect. But with this kind of thing, I don't think it really matters. Nobody is becoming a worse person because they got a sense of closure from this kind of dream or experience.
Yeah,
It's not harming people's mental health. People can go down rabbit holes with it. It's very unfortunate to say that Elizabeth Kubler Ross got involved with the phony medium and her career went in an unfortunate sidetrack because of these experiences she had writing on death and dying. But it doesn't change the fact she did some really important work and she changed the culture of how we see the people that are dying. in a positive way. And we're rapidly running out of time, so I should touch on the last two groups real quick.
Oh yeah.
So there's the other side of the return, which I already alluded to briefly, which are wicked souls do in fact sometimes come back. Um, but in that case, they don't come back of their own free will. They're brought back by demons as part of a haunting,
Hmm.
and it's a way. It's not a pleasant thing for them. It's a form of torment. They're used to torment the living, and but they themselves are being tormented. Um, the last group, the last type of experience, and I hesitate to even call this a haunting because it's so weird and it's so rare. There are a pair of women that went to visit Versailles Castle or Palace.
Hmm.
Uh, okay, here we go. Moberly Jourdain, um, which was happened in 1911, or they published a book about this in 1911, I guess.
Huh.
Um, they visited on August 10th of 1901. They went to Versailles. They didn't think much of the palace after touring it, so they decided to walk through the gardens of Petit Trianon. My French is non-existent, and found upon reaching the Grand Trianon, it was closed to the public. They remembered traveling with a black guidebook, but they became lost after missing the turn on the main avenue. Essentially, they stepped backwards in time into a party being thrown on the grounds by a whole bunch of people in period dress, talking in old French, or more archaic form of French. Had this entire experience, and then came back to the modern world, and they're like, "Well, that was really neat." And they went to the people that worked there and went, "Hey, so what's with the reenactment going on?" And everybody looked at them like they were crazy because there was nothing like that going on at the time.
Huh.
Um, and there are all sorts of weird stories of like this. There's another set of experiences that are really fascinating in folklore, particularly of people traveling, usually in a desolate countryside, and they stop at an inn overnight and they hang out. They get to know the innkeeper. They have some good food. They have some good drink. They hang out with some of the locals. They go up to the rooms. They go to sleep for the night, and they wake up in an abandoned building that doesn't look like anybody's lived there in decades.
Yeah.
Um, that isn't real common in the modern era. It's more something you find in folklore from previous ages. Um,
Yeah.
that and the Versailles incident I mentioned. Um, other than saying it's an outright hoax, and I'm always hesitant to denounce other people's experiences,
Yeah, or like the urban legend of the phantom hitchhiker.
uh, which there's some truth to. I've actually seen some firsthand accounts of that,
Oh.
or first and second hand accounts of people. There's actually, in point of fact, I've got an EVP of one of America's most famous phantom hitchhikers.
Oh.
Um, they're really, really quickly, since we're down to a minute. There's a cemetery in Connecticut called Union Cemetery that famously has a white lady. We'll talk about this more another time when we have time. But the White Lady of Union Cemetery is a famous phantom hitchhiker. Out there one night, we actually got EVP of a woman's voice in that cemetery saying, "Help me," um, which is a great subject to talk about another time because it is time that we get going before the live stream gets cut off. Um, I want to thank everybody for listening. Please remember, if you enjoyed what you see, to like, comment, and subscribe. If you got some money that's burning a hole in that wallet, feel free to consider our Patreon, patreon.com/demonology. Links in the description. My email's in there too if you have any questions, comments, concerns. Um, that's going to do it for tonight, everybody. This is Kevin Meares, Paranormal Encyclopedia, saying have a good night. And
Brian McKinley saying, keep your fangs sharp.
Good night, everybody, and God bless. I do think I'm going to try and do a reading from the book since it's been a while. Just keep an eye out. It'll be a moment or two if so. But that's it for now. Have a good night. We'll see you next week. And